to begin by saying today that we are not primarily human doings, but we are human beings. This reminder that we are human beings is a huge part of what I love about baptism, which itself is one of my favorite parts of church. Last month, I told many of you about this. You may remember that my now 10-month-old daughter, Andy, was baptized in Berkeley, and it was a very special day. And it's kind of mind-bending, in a way, to think that she participated in the exact same ritual that Jesus did so many generations ago and links them now in between. Now, even though we often think of baptism as quintessentially and perhaps uniquely Christian, the Bible reminds us that baptism was already happening before Jesus came along. We heard today that John the Baptist had been baptizing people here and there and really had quite a following. John the Baptist was known as an apocalyptic leader who preached that something really big was about to happen. And he told people to get ready for this, they better repent and change their ways, to be baptized as a sign that they were already living into the new ways of the new world as it would come to be. Now, often when we talk about baptism, when we hear this presented, we might think that this is really about personal sin, that at the time people had been making maybe some bad or immoral choices. And when we hear about this big change that was coming, that John was preaching about, some people present this like it is God's judgment and angry vengeance coming to shut all of that bad stuff down. So from that perspective, baptism kind of seems like it's about people separating themselves, kind of exempting themselves, sidestepping all the badness to say, oh no, not us. We are honest, upstanding citizens, unlike basically everyone else. And if we think about our other Bible reading today about the sheep, we might think again about baptism in that way of bringing lost and wayward souls into the land of salvation. But I actually don't think that was the case. In John's time, the ways that the world had turned away from God were in many ways more about systems and structures than individual choices, more about inequality and the unequal distribution of the earth's good and more than sufficient resources. So from that perspective, then baptism wasn't so much about individuals exempting themselves in lifeboats from a sea of wickedness or saving themselves in a holier-than-thou sort of way, but more an collective act of bravery to come together to be part of the repair of society and the repair of the world. To be part of ending the systems that cause some to be lost and left behind in the first place, to make a world where everyone could be found. And baptism in that is partly saying my identity is primarily that of a person of hope and faith and love, not so much my class or nationality, not my job or anything else. In today's first Bible story, we often zero in on Jesus' baptism as if it was the only thing going on, but I like the reminder that Jesus wasn't the only person baptized that day. Jesus, as unique and special as he was baptized as part of a group, alongside others who also wanted to be part of that standing for hope and change and creating heaven here on earth. I like that idea, but it also doesn't totally resonate either, because when I think about baptism, it's not only an active thing, it's actually not even primarily an active thing. It's also totally receptive. Maybe it's somewhere in between. In being baptized, we receive. It's done to us, for us, and on our behalf. It is a gift that is given. Like my daughter Andy, many of us have no idea even what is happening in that moment, and we certainly could not or did not choose it. In the words of Pope Francis, baptism is the greatest gift we receive. And I think in that moment when the water touches our face, regardless of if we chose or not to be baptized, we are a human being, not a human doing. Now, getting back to John the Baptist, I think that word apocalypse is often misunderstood too. When we hear that John was an apocalyptic preacher, This meant that he was in the business of unmasking and revealing the reality of the world, the realities of structural violence, collective trauma, and the need for change. So often, at least I think about apocalypse as a violent and destructive ending the world, but I think maybe a better understanding would be shedding light on the reality of the world, out of the veneer of politeness, out of the harm that we have perhaps become so accustomed to that many of us no longer see. It's ultimately a hopeful message, hopeful for everyone, baptized or not, good or bad, or as we heard, probably a little bit of each. It's about revealing and ending pain so that a new age of peace can begin. Now, in these past months, we may feel like we have been living through an apocalypse. Everything that was a little bit or maybe even a big bit broken has become a whole lot worse. Oppression and discrimination that might have been a little bit beneath the surface is now loud and public and officially endorsed. People who are vulnerable are not only the undocumented, but now even those of us with documents. Those with student visas, green cards, even those born in the US, but with non-citizen parents. Recently, we've heard stories of British people, Australians, Canadians like me having border trouble, being even sent to detention centers. And if this is how people from the global north are being treated, I think we know the case for others is very much worse. If we have ever been in denial that there was danger and discrimination, the honest reality of things has been in that way apocalyptically revealed. Now, getting back to the story of Jesus' baptism, when we hear of the heavens being opened in the text, what we are being reminded of is an ancient Jewish idea that there would be, on one long-awaited day, a uniting of heaven and earth. That the loving ways of God would be manifest right here on earth. When we hear of John talking about that separation of the wheat and the chaff, it sounds in a lot of ways like the promise of salvation for a chosen few and eternal punishment for the rest. It sounds like some sheep being found while others are left to be lost forever. But this is not really how things would have been understood in that context. I like to think of the winnowing of the chaff better as the removal of impediments to justice and mercy so that the wheat of God's abundant banquet from heaven can nourish the whole good earth. That dream, to me at least, feels farther off than ever today, but I think we need that vision now. I appreciate, too, that Jesus did not baptize himself, nor was he baptized alone, as I said. He knew that he needed others, teachers and guides, as well as companions. He knew he needed to receive God's Spirit and saw himself fundamentally connected to others. This reminds me of the work we heard from Adrienne Marie Brown, who is one of my favorite authors if you're not familiar. She writes about social change and how that we need to enact on a micro scale the change that we want to see on a societal scale. So if we want a just and loving society, we need to be just and loving with our immediate relationships and even with ourselves internally. She reminds us that change happens at the speed of trust. We can't just speed past relationships and our daily lives in the name of political change. That just undermines our progress. We need to be cautious and aware, certainly, but I like that vision, that challenge to trust others into trustworthiness. And I would add maybe love others into belovedness as well. I love the story of Jesus as the Good Shepherd because it also gets at this idea that we are deeply connected to community. That if one of us suffers, if one of us is lost, God doesn't say, well, majority rules, we got most of the sheep, let's just keep going. We hear that each individual matters and that we can't have the well-being of the group without the well-being of each part of the group. When one is lost, all are lost. As we hear from Brown, small matters because small is all. How we treat the one who is lost echoes out into how we treat all. Now, another part of what I love about baptism is what it is not. How it is so different from much in our world. Baptism is not an achievement, it's not a purchase. It's not really an understanding, and it doesn't require cognitive comprehension. It's not something that really requires much of us in a direct way at all. In a way, it doesn't change anything. You could almost say it's the most ineffective thing you could think of. There's no physical mark. Often the person being baptized doesn't remember it or maybe even know that it happened. You can't really prove if it's been done or if it hasn't. It doesn't get you anything, nor does it preclude or prevent anything else. It's a simple moment of human being. It's really quite countercultural. If we were to create a sort of baptism-like ritual today with our conventional standards, it would probably be quite different. It would likely require some courses, maybe some standardized tests, definitely a lot of waivers to be signed. It would probably involve a lot of human doing, so to speak. There would be documentation, databases, maybe different membership tiers with names of precious metals like the silver tier and the gold tier and maybe an exclusive platinum level. There would definitely be a fee and even maybe a monthly recurring charge designed for us to forget about it and just keep paying each month. It might come with a reusable tote bag, whether you need another one or not. So in this day, in our time, it might even be something that you needed to be born in a certain place in order to get. Maybe your parents would need to be born there too. And maybe if you weren't, maybe you could wait in line, have some interviews, pay fees, and wait to try to prove your way in, only to be always treated as a foreigner, a second-class citizen, and have that baptism questioned at every turn, every checkpoint, every job interview. But it's not, it's quite the opposite. Nationality, money, even criminal records don't affect our baptism. Nothing can. We just have to be a person, be able to receive. Now, it is important, I will say, not to romanticize baptism. There have been people throughout history, and still now, who try to make it into something I believe it is not. People who try to use it as a way to differentiate those who are saved from those who are not, those who are destined for heaven and those who are lost, destined for somewhere else. Baptism has been a requirement for marriage and school attendance, and there have been people who have wanted to be baptized who have found themselves excluded. It's also been, and we know, looking at colonial history, something that has been forced, imposed, and tricked upon folks. But I do believe that that is not ultimately what it should be. At its core, all that is required is to receive and to be a human being. There's no doing, no action required, no benefit that should come from it, no benefit that should be denied. There should be a fundamental equality in it. We see babies become equal to elders, the poor receiving exactly the same as the rich. We may not speak the same language, live in the same part of the world, or even the same century, but here we are, in baptism, we are one and the same. Now maybe you are thinking about yourself right now. Maybe you have been baptized, maybe you haven't. And in a way, I don't believe that really that distinction matters all that much. I believe baptism is a sacrament, and one definition of a sacrament is a visible sign of God's invisible grace, a sign of something that is already and always true. It's meaningful, sure, but the meaning is there. Your belovedness is there, even without the act. Baptism, I like this analogy, that baptism is kind of like a birthday party. You get older if you have a party, and you also get older even if you don't have a party. But I tend to think that baptism, like birthday parties, are pretty great. Now, as I reflect on my own life, I think in a lot of ways I was probably raised a bit more to be a human doing than a human being. Most of us, in fact, probably have been told from a young age to work hard, to make something of myself, make a difference in the world. And surely these are very good things. But I like that baptism reminds me, and I think reminds all of us, that our ultimate worth does not come from our doing, but from our being. I remember being a teenager, and my minister at church told me that my value did not come from my accomplishments, and that God loved me just for being a human being, not a human doing like I so often was, especially at that time. That challenged me in a good way, as an achievement and doing-oriented person, and I wouldn't say I really changed much about my outward behavior. But my perspective shifted when I started to believe that my accomplishments didn't define my worth. There is something really fragile about identity built on doing, because you always have to keep proving yourself. The glow of any accomplishment fades quickly, and there is always this insatiable need for more. There is no rest. But if our value comes from being rather than doing, well, that's a pretty firm foundation. The reminder just to be is a blessing. I wonder whether some of this resonates with you at all. And I ask you to consider that question. Where do you find your value? Do you think you're more of a human doing or a human being? Maybe that has changed throughout your life. But where are you right now? More in a doing mode, more in a being mode? If you are introducing yourself to someone else, do you start with what you do or with who you are? Do you even have a sense of who you might be outside of the things that you do? Or if you couldn't do those things, who might you be? Maybe even some of you cannot do the things that you used to do. And I invite you to reflect. Do you know that you are just as worthy now? I know that many of these are very hard questions, and I'm not always good at answering them myself, but I think they're a good kind of hard. It's not that doing good is a problem, and we know that there is so much that desperately needs to be done in our world. But I think I want to challenge us, myself included, to think about our motivation. Does our doing come from a place of uncertainty, of needing to define ourselves, needing to prove something? Or does our doing come out of sure trust in our belovedness and the desire to let that goodness shine out? Do you know that you are blessed and beloved just as you are? That God's love is as sure as the morning, and that the waters of baptism are within your very being, those waters that make up over 70% of who we are. Now, it's certainly our call to do what we can, but it is our blessing and our birthright that we simply exist, that we have been gifted this beautiful and messy and perfect life. Baptized or not, the Spirit of God is within us, and we don't need to do anything to earn it, and nothing can make it go away. The small love that you can offer is what matters most. Small is all. You may feel in some ways to be lost in life, but God's blessing and love will be always there to be found. Just to be is a blessing, and nothing can ever take that from any of us. Let us be freed from all of the limitations, all of the illusions that hold us back. The truest thing is that we are chosen, known, and loved. May the God who has known your name from before it was ever spoken aloud be with you, behold you fast, and free you from every fear, and be with you now and forevermore. Amen.